All right. Let's talk a little bit about how your breathing rate is controlled. So you may remember from the last part of Biology 201, if your brain wasn't completely turned to mush, that the respiratory centers for controlling your breathing rate are located in the medulla oblongata and also the pons. So there are neurons in those two portions of your brainstem that are concerned with controlling your breathing rate and also the depth of breathing. You know, how shallow is your breathing, how deeply are you breathing? Are you making big use of those respiratory volumes, or are you just doing normal little tidal volumes? So there are clusters of these neurons. One cluster forms a group called the dorsal respiratory group. So it's going to be on the dorsal side of the brainstem. It's actually near the root of cranial nerve number 9. Remember all those from Biology 201? And that takes input from stretch receptors in the lungs that are detecting the level of inflation of the lungs, and also chemoreceptors that are detecting the levels of oxygen gas and carbon dioxide gas and pH as well. And then you have another group of neurons called the ventral respiratory group. And these are the neurons that are concerned with setting your breathing rhythm. Eupnea refers to EU, that prefix usually means true, like your true breathing rate, eupnea, which is about 12 to 15 breaths per minute. And the neurons in this group, they actually have to send signals to the motor neurons that control your diaphragm, those intercostal muscles, to stimulate them to contract to help control your breathing. Then there also are expiratory neurons. So there are neurons that have to inhibit these neurons that are trying to excite your diaphragm and intercostal muscles. You've got some neurons that have to inhibit those so that the diaphragm and those other muscles will relax so that you can exhale. Okay, so this diagram from your textbook is just showing you, there's the dorsal respiratory group where you have some of these little cluster of neurons, and then there's the ventral respiratory group where you have that other little cluster of neurons, and both of those are concerned with helping you control respiration. And then there's another respiratory center up here in the pons, up in here, called the pontine respiratory center, which interacts with these two centers. So the neuron synapse between them, and this one helps smooth your breathing patterns. All right, so what's actually influencing your respiration? So some of this, you know, if you're kind of thinking along the lines, like I said, of CO2 functioning kind of like an acid in your body fluids. So let's think about what's going to happen. If the partial pressure of CO2 rises in your bloodstream, that condition is called hypercapnia. If you have capnia, you're referring to CO2 levels. Yeah, so if you have excess, like let's say you're exercising heavily, your skeletal muscles are giving off lots of CO2 from doing lots of cellular respiration. So that excess CO2 is also going to get into, these things diffuse back and forth from your bloodstream and into your tissue. So that's going to get into your the tissue fluids of your brain. It's going to combine with water to make carbonic acid. That's going to dissociate and release those hydrogen ions. pH is going down. CO2 is functioning like an acid. So you have chemoreceptors in your brainstem that can detect that increase in hydrogen ions. Okay, and so when they do that, what are they going to do to your breathing rate? You've got excess CO2, so you need to breathe that CO2 out. You need to exhale it out. So those respiratory centers are going to increase the depth and the rate of your breathing. That makes sense. Some other receptors that are involved with monitoring what's going on in your body fluids. These are the ones that we just talked about over here. But you also have some of these receptors, chemoreceptors, that are nervous tissue located in your carotid arteries and also in the aorta that detect the same thing. They detect an increase in CO2, and so they'll send signals to your respiratory centers in the medulla, and then those respiratory centers will stimulate your respiratory muscles to increase your breathing rates. So those respiratory muscles will contract more frequently, and you'll also have stronger contractions so that they'll wind up increasing the depth of your breathing. And then if you exhale out CO2, think about that like you're exhaling out acid. So your body fluid pH will go this way. I'm sorry, it'll go back upward toward the normal range. Now, what about if you're hyperventilating? You're breathing too fast. In that condition, you can develop pretty quickly what's called hypocapnia. So levels of CO2 in your body fluids are too low. When that happens, the blood vessels in your brain can constrict, those arterioles, due to low CO2 levels, and that can actually cut off the blood supply to sort of important tissues in your brain. You can develop cerebral ischemia, a cutoff of blood flow to the brain. This term apnea, I'm sure we've all heard that term before. Probably know somebody who has sleep apnea. That is when you have breathing ceases temporarily because CO2 levels are abnormally low in your body fluids. Yeah, and so why would low CO2 levels trigger you to stop breathing? Well, if your levels of CO2 in your body fluids are too low, your body fluid pH is going up. It's probably getting too high. So all those little chemoreceptors that detect CO2 levels, they're not going to be activated. So they're not going to trigger the breathing response. If your CO2 levels are too low in your body fluids, you don't want to exhale as much and continue blowing out CO2 because that would cause your body fluid pH to keep going upward. All right, now what about, you would think that the levels of oxygen gas in your tissues would also influence breathing as well, and they do. You do have nervous tissues called chemoreceptors, those chemoreceptors in your aorta and carotid arteries that detect, they respond to levels of O2. So if you have a big drop in your arterial partial pressure of oxygen gas, so normal is about 95. If it drops to about 60, these chemoreceptors detect that, and they'll stimulate you to increase your rate of breathing and depth of breathing to help you oxygenate your blood better. And this diagram from your textbook is just showing you these carotid bodies where these chemoreceptors are located. They're located right there where the common carotid artery splits into the internal and the external. And so they're, the axons from the neurons that are located there travel up here to those respiratory centers in the brainstem. And then you have the same kind of setup here with those chemoreceptors that are sitting there around the aortic arch as well. So they're connected to those respiratory centers in the medulla oblongata. Arterial pH. Okay, actually pH just by itself. So there are conditions where your CO2 and O2 levels might be completely normal, but you could have decreased pH anyway. So for things like if you have accumulation of lactic acid, remember that from the muscular system. Lactic acid is a byproduct of anaerobic respiration in your skeletal muscles, and accumulates from things like sprints, strenuous activity, and so an excessive amount of that, it's an acid, so it can cause your body fluid pH to drop. And if that was the case, then one way that your body can compensate for that is to have you breathe more heavily. That way you'll exhale out more CO2. The more CO2 you exhale out, that's going to help your body fluid pH go up. Or diabetic patients, if you did a diabetic case study as part of your Biology 202 class, they produce these ketones that function as acids, and they can also help lower the pH of your body fluids. The ketones are products of them having to rely almost exclusively on fats and proteins to supply their energy needs. So that can happen in diabetes mellitus patients. And then again, another way to compensate for that, if your body fluids have low pH because you're a diabetic and you're producing these ketone molecules as wastes, you can breathe more rapidly and more deeply to exhale out more CO2. That'll help raise your pH back up. So your respiratory system, and you're going to hear more about this in your acid-base balance lectures, but your respiratory system, by increasing rate and depth of breathing, can help raise your pH when it's too low. Some other things that can influence your breathing: you have pulmonary irritant reflexes. So there are, when you breathe in irritants, things that really shouldn't be moving downward into your lungs, your bronchioles, there are receptors in your bronchioles that detect those, and there are reflexes that constrict your air passages to try to reduce the ability of these irritants to make it down into the more delicate tissues where your alveoli, the more delicate tissues of your alveoli. And you also have receptors in the larger respiratory passages that trigger your cough and sneeze reflexes. So when you have major irritants that need to be sneezed and coughed out, that will happen. And then remember, I did mention that there are stretch receptors within the lung tissues themselves, and really in the pleurae, the pleural membranes that surround the lungs. They detect when the lungs have inflated. You don't want the lungs to just keep inflating in an out of control manner. Once they have inflated as large as they need to inflate, you have these stretch receptors that detect that. They're nervous tissues. They send signals to the respiratory centers in the brain that basically say, hey, okay, we've inflated. You need to now inhibit contraction of those respiratory muscles so that the lungs can deflate. Respiratory adjustments that take place due to exercise. Adjustments are geared both towards intensity and duration. So, all right, so let's think about this. You're exercising, you're generating, you need lots of oxygen gas, right, to fuel your cells that need energy for exercise. They're doing lots of cellular respiration. They're giving off lots of CO2. So what are you going to have to do to your breathing rate? You're going to have to increase it. You need more oxygen gas. You got to get rid of that excess CO2. Otherwise, your body fluids are going to become too acidic. Oh, and yes, your respiratory system is very good at doing that. It'll increase your breathing rate. That's called hyperpnea, is an increased respiratory rate. And think about this, even anticipating exercising, you start to increase your breathing rate. Like when you're lacing up your running shoes because you're getting ready to go on a run, your brain, the cortex of your brain, communicates with those respiratory centers and says, hey, let's go ahead and start stimulating the breathing rate to go up because we're about to need a whole lot of oxygen gas. Some respiratory adjustments. What happens when you adapt to a higher altitude? So you may have talked about this when you did cardiovascular in Unit 1, about how the kidneys, one way that you can improve delivery of oxygen gas when you're at high altitudes and there are low oxygen gas levels is for the kidneys to secrete EPO, erythropoietin. and that's going to stimulate an increase in red blood cell production in your bone marrow. So that's one thing that happens, but also your respiratory rate and depth will wind up being adjusted. Because when you first move to a location or you travel to a location with a very high altitude and they have lower oxygen gas levels that are there, you're going to have hypoxia in many of your tissues. So you're going to experience headaches, nausea, shortness of breath because your brainstem's not controlling your breathing rate properly, dizziness, and in really severe cases, your blood pressure goes up so high to try to accommodate what's going on, you can wind up with brain and pulmonary edema. But eventually, you do acclimatize or adapt, and then your respiratory rate and depth will be adjusted. So your respiratory center will get used to the new conditions and adjust your breathing rate appropriately. Let's see, some disorders, some imbalances of the respiratory system. Some of these I've kind of talked about already as part of your respiratory lecture. COPD, we hear about that all the time. That's chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. A couple of examples: if you have chronic bronchitis, inflammation of the bronchi, which could be due to infections or it could be due to irritants from things like smoking. Emphysema, very common in smokers. Obstructive pulmonary disease, you're taking air in, but because you have obstruction of your respiratory passages, you can't get the air out. You can't get that CO2-rich air out as easily. So that is certainly interfering with those processes. You can wind up with dyspnea, labored breathing, air hunger because of COPD. Again, generally this is associated with smoking. It will lead to coughing and frequent pulmonary infections. And most victims eventually are going to develop respiratory failure. It's going to get to the point where you cannot exchange gases properly. You can't get the CO2 out, which causes the pH in your body fluids to go down. And that condition is called respiratory acidosis, where you have low pH because you're not able to exhale CO2 properly. You'll be hearing more about that in your acid-base balance lecture. Yeah, I think this diagram from your textbook, figure 22.27, is just mainly showing what I just talked about. Tobacco smoke and air pollution, though, one of the reasons why do you develop emphysema? The elastin in the connective tissues of your blood that helps your lungs rebound properly during inhaling and exhaling, that breaks down with exposure to air pollution and tobacco smoke, and that's what can lead to emphysema and interferes with your ability to breathe properly. Oh, there's also a genetic defect that can lead to emphysema as well. It's called an alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. And in those people who have that deficiency, their elastic fibers in the connective tissues of their lungs actually get digested inappropriately, and so they just don't have as many of them. Asthma. Asthma is caused by an exaggerated immune response, so your immune system is overreacting to some irritant or irritants. And of course the characterization: difficulty breathing, coughing, wheezing, chest tightness. And this is caused by you have inflammation in the bronchial passages. That causes the bronchial tubes to constrict. Supposedly that's helping limit nasty things from getting to those delicate alveoli, but it also can interfere with breathing when it winds up being bad enough. Also, whenever you have inflammation, you have fluid that leaks out of your bloodstream and into the surrounding tissues. And so those fluids plus the mucus present in the respiratory tract, that's called your inflammatory exudate, that just blocks up those bronchial passages even more and increases the problem. Another homeostatic imbalance, tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is an infectious disease that's caused by a bacterium, a bacterial organism called Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which you'll learn about when you take microbiology. This is nasty, and it is, there's some risk that this is going to start becoming more of a problem in the United States again, because there are strains of this type of bacterium that have become resistant to a lot of drugs that were typically used to treat it. So it's something we're going to have to be careful about. But this is nasty. It's a infection that can go on for years and years and years, and it leads to horrible destruction of the lungs. These are some lungs from at autopsy from a patient who had a very severe case of tuberculosis, and you basically wind up with these hollow cavities of liquefied lung tissue in your lungs. And so obviously at some point that's going to kill you when it gets bad enough. Lung cancer, just briefly, some of the different types of lung cancer. Pretty common type of cancer. About 90% of all cases are linked to smoking. And there are 3 types, and you'll hear about people who are diagnosed with these types. About 20 to 40% of cases are squamous cell carcinomas. So the squamous cells are those thin, flat cells that are, making up those the linings of the air sacs, the alveoli. So if one of those cells becomes cancerous, that means it's dividing in an out of control manner, and then it winds up taking on the ability to spread to another part of the body. So if a cancer arises from one of those types of cells in the lungs, it's called a squamous cell carcinoma. An adenocarcinoma of the lungs, about 40% of are those types of cases. And those arise from other cell types that are present in the housing portions of the lungs and not so much the alveoli. And then finally, there's another type of lung cancer called small cell carcinoma. This occurs in about 20% of the cases. And there are cells that are lymphocyte-like. If one of those starts dividing in an out-of-control manner and develops the ability to spread to other parts of the body, that means it can metastasize, it can actually spread. That's called a small cell carcinoma, those types. They originate from these lymphocyte-like cells that live in the primary bronchi. Just a couple of developmental aspects about your respiratory system, and then we'll finally be done with respiration. A fetus, by about the 28th week, if it's delivered prematurely at that point, it can breathe on its own, but it's going to need some assistance for a while. Obviously, that's a very early delivery, 28th week versus 40 at full term. And a lot of times they have to give these premature infants surfactants to help prevent their alveoli from collapsing. And of course, as you guys know, the fetal lungs are not used until the infant is born. So they're actually filled with fluid while the fetus is still in the womb. And blood is bypassing the lungs at that point. While a fetus is still in the womb, the gas exchange takes place in the placenta, as you guys have learned before. Now, when you're born, those respiratory centers in your brainstem, they get activated. You start breathing, starts triggering the contraction of the diaphragm, intercostal muscles, those alveoli, they inflate, and your lungs begin to function. Respiratory rates in newborns are the highest, and then they gradually slow down as we move towards adulthood. You keep making more and more alveoli actually until young adulthood as well. And then as you guys, I think we probably all know this, as you get older, your respiratory efficiency decreases. You're losing some of that elasticity in your lungs, just like you lose it in other parts of the body. And some of these alveoli, those little tiny air sacs, those millions and millions, some of them die and they get replaced with scar tissue as you get older, and they're not functioning in helping you with gas exchange. So that's another reason why as you get older, your respiratory efficiency is just going to decrease pretty much no matter what you do. Okay, so we're finally done with the respiratory system. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask me. Thank you very much for listening.